Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. If a perfectly good God exists, why is the world filled with catastrophic suffering? I mean, it is the ultimate atheist critique. Today, we are taking a deep dive into how ancient humanity grappled with this exact question, leading to the invention of the devil. We'll explore the evolution of Satan from a divine middle manager to a cosmic rebel, and how two distinct frameworks, the Bible and Zoroastrianism, radically altered the definition of God to make sense of a broken world.
Yeah, and we are analyzing historical texts and linguistic evolution to really uncover how the concepts of absolute good and absolute evil evolved over millennia.
Right.
Our mission in this deep dive is to look at these ancient theologies entirely objectively. So we're not approaching them as religious dogmas. We're looking at them as humanity's earliest, most sophisticated attempts to engineer philosophical answers to the reality of suffering.
Exactly. And before we unpack these ancient philosophical frameworks, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. So let's start with the baseline of this debate.
Okay, lay it out for us.
When you listen to modern debates between atheists and theists, the cornerstone of the skeptical argument is always the problem of evil.
Oh, absolutely. It always comes back to that.
Right. Atheists will point to, childhood illnesses, natural disasters, or horrific wars and ask a very logical question. If God is all-powerful, he could stop this.
And if he is all good, he would want to.
Exactly. So since the suffering exists, God must either be weak, cruel, or just non-existent. But if you look at ancient Israel, like long before the Babylonian exile, the theologians of that era didn't actually struggle with this paradox.
No, they didn't. Their theology was actually brutally straightforward.
Wait, really? How did they view it?
Well, the pre-exilic Israelite worldview operated on a framework of absolute, uncompromising divine sovereignty. In their understanding, God does absolutely everything.
Wow, literally everything.
Everything. There is no independent cosmic force of evil. The good, the bad, the catastrophic, it all flows from a single centralized divine source.
So there's no devil to blame at this point.
Not at all. We can see this explicitly in foundational texts like Isaiah 45.7, where God actually declares, I form light and create darkness, I make peace and I create evil.
That is intense. They really don't shy away from it.
They don't. The ancient Hebrew text is very blunt. In these early narratives, God actively hardens Pharaoh's heart to ensure he won't release the Israelites.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and God sends distressing or evil spirits to torment King Saul. God directly brings disaster upon cities. It's just a theology of total, absolute control.
Which, honestly, operates very much like a monolithic corporate structure. If you imagine God as the CEO of the universe, he is taking direct credit and direct blame for every single action the company takes.
That's a great way to put it. There are no rogue departments to blame.
Right. There's no rogue manager ruining a product launch. The CEO signed off on it all. But from a philosophical standpoint, this creates a massive vulnerability, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a huge one, yeah.
Because if God is the literal author of evil and actively causes human suffering, doesn't that inherently validate the modern atheist argument? I mean, it seems impossible to argue that a deity responsible for creating calamity is entirely benevolent.
And that is the exact philosophical wall that ancient thinkers eventually crashed into. And that collision wasn't just theoretical, it was violently historical.
What do you mean by violently historical?
It happened in the year 586 BC. That is when the Babylonian Empire besieged Jerusalem, breached the walls, razed the city, and burned the Holy Temple to the ground.
Just total destruction.
Complete devastation. They deported the surviving population, marching them hundreds of miles into the desert into exile. I want you to imagine the psychological devastation of that moment.
It must have been unimaginable.
It really was. The temple was believed to be the literal geographic footstool of God on earth. So its destruction was an apocalyptic trauma. Suddenly, this straightforward theology that God does everything faced a terminal crisis.
Because how do you reconcile that?
Exactly. If you're sitting in the ashes of your city, grieving your lost family, and your theology dictates that your God is the direct, unmitigated cause of this horrific suffering, how can you possibly maintain that this God is good and worthy of worship?
Right. You're basically staring at the ruins of your life, asking, why did our perfectly good CEO just burn the entire company to the ground?
Precisely. It forces a theological breaking point.
So to survive that existential crisis, humanity had to innovate. They had to look for a solution to explain why bad things happen without indicting the character of God.
And from the historical texts we're examining, it looks like ancient civilizations essentially engineered two distinct pathways out of this paradox.
Okay, let's explore those.
Well, one civilization decided to completely redefine the concept of divine omnipotence, while another decided to hire a cosmic fall guy.
A cosmic fall guy. I love that. Let's explore that first pathway, though. If you are a philosopher looking at a burning world, how do you logically rescue God's reputation?
You do it by removing him from the role of the supreme creator of everything. That was the radical solution offered by the ancient Persian religion of Zoroastrianism.
Okay, Zoroastrianism. Tell me about that.
It was introduced between 1500 and 1000 BCE by a prophet named Zoroaster. And this tradition solved the problem of evil by fundamentally denying God's absolute power.
Really? They just admitted God wasn't all-powerful.
Yeah. In the Zoroastrian framework, the supreme creator is Ahura Mazda, the wise lord. He created the universe entirely good, and he did it through thought. There's no flaw in his design.
Okay, so it starts perfect?
Exactly. However, he is opposed by an entity named Angra, the destructive spirit. And here is the crucial philosophical pivot, because Angra is uncreated.
Wait, let's pause on that word. Uncreated, because that completely upends the traditional Western view, right?
Completely.
We are so used to the idea of a fallen angel, a being that God created who later turned bad. But Zoroastrianism is saying this destructive spirit is a co-eternal rival. He just exists independent of God.
That independence is the core of their dualistic system.
Mm-hmm.
Ahura Mazda is perfectly good, but because he has an uncreated rival, he is genuinely limited in his immediate power.
So evil isn't God's fault at all.
Right. Evil is a real, autonomous force invading the universe. It's not a tool God uses to teach us lessons. It's not something God passively permits, and it is certainly not a byproduct of God's creation.
That's a huge shift.
It is. Because of this dynamic, God actually needs help fighting this cosmic war. And that is where the profound psychological brilliance of Zoroastrianism comes into play. It gives human beings radical cosmic free will.
Which means we aren't just pawns on a divine chessboard. Our actions have actual stakes.
Massive stakes. Every choice you make in your daily life, what they categorize as good thoughts, good words, and good deeds, literally generates spiritual energy that helps God push back the darkness.
Wow, so you're actively fighting alongside God.
Yes. The universe is locked in a linear war, moving toward a final massive renovation called the Frashokareti.
The Frashokareti? What does that look like?
The texts describe this as a purifying river of molten metal that will cover the earth.
Oh, that sounds terrifying.
Well, for the righteous, it will feel like warm milk, but it will burn away all corruption and permanently annihilate Engerminu.
That is wild. The mechanics of this are deeply fascinating because they mirror the Epicurean paradox.
Oh yeah, exactly.
And for you listening, that paradox is the favorite tool of the modern atheist. It goes, if God is willing to prevent evil, but not able, then he is not omnipotent. If he is able but not willing, then he is malevolent.
Right.
So Zoroastrianism looks directly at that paradox and answers, well, he is completely willing, but he is not entirely omnipotent yet. They solve the problem of evil by openly admitting God's limitation.
Yes, they do.
But if you limit God's power just to save his moral goodness, aren't you essentially shrinking the definition of God? I mean, does having an uncreated rival make the creator seem less worthy of reverence?
It requires a profound theological trade-off. You are sacrificing absolute power to preserve absolute moral purity. However, for a Zoroastrian, a perfectly good God who is fighting in the trenches of history alongside you commands far more reverence than an aloof, omnipotent God who sits back and permits you to suffer.
That makes a lot of sense.
It's a deeply empowering philosophy because it elevates human ethics to a matter of cosmic survival. You aren't just enduring history, you are actively rescuing it.
Okay, so Zoroastrianism protects God's moral character by limiting his power. But the Jewish scribes who were actually interacting with the Persian Empire during their exile in Babylon, they took an entirely different route, right?
They did. They refused to limit God's absolute, unlimited power. They held on to their pre-exilic belief in divine sovereignty.
But they still desperately needed to externalize the evil to make sense of the suffering they were enduring. And this tension is what gives birth to the evolution of Satan.
Exactly. Tracing the linguistic evolution of this concept in the Hebrew Bible reveals exactly how they engineered this framework. The word Satan originally wasn't a proper name at all.
It wasn't.
No, it is simply a Hebrew common noun that means adversary or accuser. When it appears in the earliest texts, with the definite article in Hebrew, Satan, it functions strictly as a job title. It just means the adversary.
Okay, to put that in modern terms, it's like saying the prosecutor in a courtroom. You wouldn't capitalize it and call the lawyer prosecutor as if it were his first name.
Exactly. And the book of Job provides the perfect case study for this mechanism. In the opening chapters of Job, the Satan is just a functioning member of the divine council.
So he's working for God.
Yes.
Yeah.
Think of this council like an ancient Near Eastern royal court. The adversary is basically a royal inspector general or a prosecuting attorney whose job is to patrol the earth, observe human behavior, and test their faithfulness to the king.
And he operates strictly under God's explicit permission, right?
Completely. He cannot lay a finger on Job or Job's property without God authorizing the exact parameters of the test. He's literally just a divine middle manager doing the job he was hired to do.
Wow. But then we get to a massive watershed moment in the biblical texts. There's a story about King David taking a military census of Israel.
Right, the census story.
Yeah, and in ancient times, taking a census was considered a sin because it meant the king was relying on the strength of his own army rather than relying on God's protection. This exact historical event is recorded twice in the Bible, but written centuries apart.
This is such a fascinating textual detail.
It really is.
Oh.
In 2 Samuel chapter 24, which was written before the exile, the text says that the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and God incited David to take the census. God then punishes Israel for this census with a plague that kills 70,000 people.
That is the ultimate expression of the pre-exilic theology we discussed earlier. God does everything. He even incites the very sin that he turns around and punishes.
But here is the critical shift. Centuries later, after the horrific trauma of the Babylonian exile, a different scribe rewrites this exact same history in 1 Chronicles chapter 21. And this time, the text says, Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel. It is like two parents telling you a story about a broken vase. Mom says, you broke the vase. Dad says, a demon possessed your hand and broke the vase.
That's a perfect analogy.
It is the same broken vase, but the theological implications are entirely different. But let's look at the mechanics of this. How did ancient scribes get away with literally rewriting their own sacred history without their followers revolting?
Well, we have to understand how ancient textual traditions functioned. The ancient mind didn't view rewriting texts as falsifying history. They viewed it as updating the theological lens based on progressive revelation.
So it was like a software update for their theology.
Exactly. If we look closely at the Hebrew grammar in 1 Chronicles, the chronicler does something revolutionary. He drops the definite article. It is no longer Satan, the adversary. It is just Satan. Yeah, this is the exact grammatical moment in the biblical text where Satan transitions from a job title into a proper name. He becomes an independent spiritual entity. The post-exilic thinkers are essentially externalizing the temptation to get God off the hook for directly causing David to sin.
They needed a cosmic fall guy to protect God's reputation.
They absolutely did.
And once they cracked that door open, this concept completely exploded in the literature written between the Old and New Testament. You have texts like the Book of Jubilees.
Ah, yes, Jubilees.
For you listening who might be unfamiliar, the Book of Jubilees is an ancient Jewish apocryphal text written in the 2nd century BCE. It was incredibly popular. We know this because many copies were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right, it was a major text.
And Jubilees essentially retells the stories of Genesis and Exodus, but it introduces a new character named Mastema, who is the chief of demons. The author of Jubilees goes through the early Bible and retroactively blames Mastema for all the morally questionable things God supposedly did.
It's a massive rewrite.
It is. Remember in Exodus where the text says God weirdly tried to kill Moses at an encampment? Jubilees rewrites it and says, no, that was Mastema. When God tells Abraham to traumatize his son Isaac by sacrificing him on a mountain, Jubilees explicitly says Mastema suggested that twisted test, not God.
What you are seeing in the Book of Jubilees is Theodicy happening in real time.
Theodicy being the philosophical attempt to justify God's actions in a world full of evil.
Precisely. These scribes are taking pieces of their own ancient scriptures, wrestling with their current suffering under oppressive foreign empires like the Greeks and Romans, and aggressively developing a sophisticated theology of a cosmic rebel.
So they didn't just borrow this from Zoroastrianism.
No, they didn't just copy the dualism. They excavated the concept from within their own tradition. They connected the dots between rebellious divine beings in Genesis, the prosecuting adversary in Job, and the oppressive empires of their present day, fusing them into a single antagonist.
Let's push back on the core philosophy here, though. Does creating this adversary actually solve the atheist critique we started with? Let's return to the CEO analogy.
Okay, let's go back to the CVO.
In this evolving biblical framework, God is still absolutely sovereign. Satan is not an uncreated rival, he is a created being. If God is sovereign and permits the adversary to cause human suffering or permits Mistema to test Abraham, isn't God still ultimately responsible?
That's a very fair question.
If a CEO knows a rogue manager is actively tormenting the employees on the factory floor and the CEO has the power to fire him but does nothing, we hold the CEO accountable.
You have identified the enduring philosophical tension of the biblical framework. By externalizing evil into a cosmic rebel, these ancient thinkers solved the problem of direct causation. They could argue God didn't do the evil.
Right.
But by maintaining God's omnipotence, they introduced the problem of divine permission. Why does an all-powerful God allow the adversary to operate at all?
And how do they answer that?
The biblical answer, which is heavily rooted in the final chapters of the book of Job, often points to a cosmic wisdom that human minds simply cannot comprehend. The framework argues that the outcome is predetermined. God will eventually crush the adversary, but the timeline requires humanity to endure a period of mixture and suffering.
So it's very different from Zoroastrianism.
It is a fundamentally different approach than Zoroastrianism's limited God, yeah. It emphasizes a sovereign master plan that incorporates but does not originate rebellion.
Okay, so they've engineered this massive cosmic adversary to explain the darkness in the world. And that brings us to the ultimate villain origin story, the Garden of Eden.
Ah, yes, the serpent.
The creature that introduces deception, ruins paradise, and breaks the world. This is where cultural assumption tells us Satan makes his grand entrance. So if Satan evolved from a divine prosecutor in later texts, how did we get to the Garden of Eden?
Well, it is entirely based on cultural osmosis. If you actually read the Hebrew text of Genesis chapter 3, the serpent is never called Satan. Not once.
Really?
Mm.
Never.
Never. In fact, the word Satan does not appear anywhere near the Garden of Eden narrative.
Which completely upends how modern culture views the text. But it makes perfect sense when you look at the original Hebrew word used for the serpent, nahash.
Yes, Nahash.
The linguistic research points out that this word is a brilliant triple entendre. Yes, it translates as serpent, but it derives from a root word meaning shining one, implying a radiant divine being.
Exactly.
Furthermore, its verb form means enchanter or someone who practices divination. So the original ancient readers weren't picturing a literal talking snake hanging from a tree branch.
No, not at all. They would have understood this character as a rebellious divine being, a shining enchanter, intentionally taking a deceptive form to seduce humanity with forbidden knowledge.
So when did people start calling the serpent Satan?
The textual evolution takes immense time. It wasn't until the very end of the biblical timeline, specifically in the book of Revelation chapter 12, verse 9.
And that was written when?
Nearly 1,500 years after Genesis. And that text explicitly says that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, it took a millennia and a half of theological development to explicitly connect those dots.
A millennia and a half.
Yeah. Through periods of immense cultural suffering, trauma, and exile, theologians slowly identified the Eden rebel as the ultimate cosmic adversary. He becomes the arch-villain of the entire biblical narrative because his specific rebellion introduced death, making him the ruler of the underworld where all humans eventually go.
But this raises a fascinating historical paradox. If the biblical texts describe this adversary as a sophisticated, shining, divine being, an angel of light who is incredibly deceptive and psychologically manipulative, how on earth did we end up with the visual of a cartoonish red guy with horns, a pointy tail, and a pitchfork?
It's quite a leap, isn't it?
Because you will not find that description anywhere in the Bible.
You certainly won't find it in the text. That specific image is a product of medieval Christian art, cultural assimilation, and historical propaganda. Oh, absolutely. To understand the mechanism here, we have to look at the transition from the Roman Empire to medieval Europe. As the church expanded into new territories, they encountered deeply entrenched pagan belief systems.
Okay, so they were competing with other religions.
Right. And the church needed a way to visually represent cosmic evil to populations that were largely illiterate. They couldn't hand a peasant a theological scroll about the angel of light. They had to communicate visually through stained glass windows, frescoes, and morality plates.
And they needed to actively terrify people away from worshiping the old pagan gods.
Exactly. So the mechanism of control was to demonize the local competition. They systematically borrowed the aesthetic of the pagan deities.
Ah, so they stole the look.
They did. They took the visual traits of Pan, the Greek god of nature who had goat hooves, furry legs, and horns. They took the iconography of Hades, or Pluto, the god of the underworld, who traditionally carried a two-pronged spear that eventually morphed into the pitchfork. And then they painted this composite creature red to symbolize the theological fires of final judgment. It was a highly effective psychological mechanism. If you want a medieval farming community to stop leaving offerings for the old nature gods, you make those gods look like the ultimate embodiment of horrifying cosmic evil.
But there is a massive historical irony here. By turning Satan into a cartoonish red monster with a pitchfork to scare peasants, these medieval artists inadvertently handed modern secularism an incredibly easy target to mock.
They really did.
Nobody today takes a guy in a red Halloween costume seriously. It sounds exactly like a fairy tale designed to scare children into behaving. But the original ancient biblical concept of an angel of light, a sophisticated, deceptive, psychological force that sounds entirely reasonable while leading you into self-destruction, that is a much more compelling, terrifying, philosophical concept.
Without a doubt.
By making him a visual cartoon, medieval Europe completely undermined the theological sophistication that took their ancestors 1,500 years to engineer.
It's true. When you reduce a complex philosophical mechanism for understanding evil into a literal monster hiding under the bed, you strip away its intellectual weight. But we have to look past the medieval cartoons.
Right.
Whether we are analyzing Zoroastrianism's twin spirits, locked in a war where human ethical choices literally power the cosmos, or the Bible's evolving cosmic adversary that externalizes the source of suffering while desperately trying to maintain divine sovereignty. These texts are remarkable.
They really are.
They represent humanity's most profound, millennia-long effort to reconcile the harsh reality of death, disease, and injustice with the desperate hope of a purposeful universe. They are not primitive fairy tales. They are ancient, deeply sophisticated answers to the exact problems of evil that continue to dominate modern theological and atheistic debates today.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, the listener. If our ancient ancestors engineered these massive, incredibly complex frameworks of cosmic rebellion, uncreated rival spirits, and divine adversaries just to process the trauma of military exile and the crushing weight of human suffering,
what new philosophical frameworks is humanity constructing right now?
exactly. To explain the chaos of our modern age, think about the tech billionaires and philosophers heavily pushing simulation theory today.
Oh, that's a brilliant connection.
They argue that our reality, including all of our suffering, might just be a glitch in a higher dimensional computer program run by an advanced civilization. Aren't they just doing the exact same thing the ancient scribes did in Babylon?
Wow, they absolutely are.
Creating a new, high-tech theodicy to explain away the pain of the world, making the universe feel a little less random and a little more manageable. Keep thinking deeper, and we'll see you next time.